So welcome back once again to Third Age Reforged and to a bit of a repeat battle. This one was also sent to me by Sareg, and it is another battle between the Dwarves and the Elves on Rivendell, where Imladris are going to be defending, obviously the Elves defending their settlement against the Dwarves. This one is actually only a 1v1, interestingly enough, and it's been a long time since I've shown a 1v1 siege. But the reason that I'm going to be showing this, I think, is just to be an accompaniment to that battle that I showed previously, because I feel as though this one might work out a little bit differently. Obviously previously we saw two very inexperienced players playing as the Elves on the defence, and they ultimately got systematically crushed by the Dwarves, sort of, well, in every engagement really. It was a very, very one-sided fight. In the end the Dwarves did end up losing a fair amount, but most of that comes down to the fact that the Elves don't really give away any casualties for free in melee at the very least, especially in Ladros. So a lot of that had to do with the closer margins than you would expect, and even then it was still a walkover. This time it should be a little bit different. We'll go through the Imladris composition first, I think, actually, seeing as we're over here, and we'll see how he's going to set up. Now obviously in a 1v1 you only will have to defend one angle of the settlement, but by the same token Sareg here, who's going to be playing as Imladris, is going to have less resources with which to defend that area, so it's going to be a little bit more one-dimensional in a way, this fight, but it's still going to be interesting to see how this works out, because obviously the Dwarves were so dominant last time that I'd be interested to see how the Elves can sort of match up this time. And Imladris in general do have the highest total defense values in the game on average, purely because they have Elven skill combined with also very high armor values, as I've said. It's really the main strength of Imladris when you put them next to the other Elves. They're really, really very strong in melee. Their compositions can also be relatively simple to make work. Even very, very elite armies we've seen in the past, full Eldarenwe armies, work out very well against certain factions. The Heru Masil in particular, they've got very high skill. Obviously, as far as heavy Elven swordsmen go, you really have to dip into the multiple HP units to get better than the Heru Masil. Really, it's only stuff like the Athalion Enanwaith and the Noldorin Blade Masters from Linden that you could say are better than the Heru Masil, and even then I think the total base defense values on the Heru Masil would actually be stronger than both of those units, but the multiple HP really is a very significant factor which would make them better. They are expensive, however. For a unit which doesn't have a shield and doesn't have multiple HP, they do cost 1,000 florins, or sort of in the ballpark of 1,000 plus, just like the Heru Matal, which does mean they are archer bait, and also cavalry will try to charge them if you let them, because that's a lot of value you can get very quickly by flattening them. We also have the God Heli Mainawa, which are the multiple HP archers that the High Elves can bring, obviously very, very multi-purpose, basically a hybrid unit for all intents and purposes between sort of heavy Elven archers and line infantry, multiple HP line infantry. Not quite as strong as they once were when they were the Nolder Elder Nobles, but then they were also grossly overpowered when they were in that form. Now you're more likely to see other units than them, but they are still strong in a defensive siege like this, or even an offensive siege. Over here, as I'm sure you saw previously, we've got a High Elven Ballista, obviously taking up a position on this bank, because it looks as though the Dwarves are actually going to limit themselves a little bit by going down the narrower path. We'll see. Obviously the Ballista could be used to very good effect if things get blobbed up, or to snipe out any Dwarven artillery they may have brought. Looks as though Imladris have gone certainly for more quality in mind as well. 2 units of Imladris Sentries, obviously one of the better pike units in the game. Again, they're in the mix alongside the likes of the 1st Legion Pikes from Khazad-dûm and the Naruna Aru Sentinels from Umbar. It's a close run thing to decide which is the best of those 3. I would probably go with the 1st Legion Pikes, but the Imladris Sentry is obviously still going to be able to do a very, very good job at holding the line, acting as the anchor. Over here we can see the Gwathi Rockdor. The General, I think you could see him actually was in the God Heli Mainawa. Over here you can see the Gwathi Rockdor, which Knights obviously, so they're going to be used in a freer role. And Khazad-dûm need to be careful, because if they do limit themselves on a path, they could end up getting rear-charged pretty substantially by the Knights. Now the Dwarves, of course, have the tools to deal with that. They have crossbows, they have pikes, they have spears galore, but even so, the danger still exists. The Gwathi Rockdor's charge is very significant, and the Dwarven morale is not watertight, especially Erebors. You know, Khazad-dûm have got slightly higher morale values, but it is possible to break the Dwarves if you do substantial enough damage quickly enough. Over here we have the Gwathi Arthand, which I'm sure you saw previously. Now, in the last battle in the comments it was said that, and I kind of agree with this, that the Gwathi Arthand may be not the optimal pick against the Dwarves, because they do still have spears, which means they're not exactly the highest in terms of attack, especially against heavily armoured Dwarven troops. They are very difficult to bring down, of course, with very high defence values, multiple HP and the like, but I would still have been very tempted to go for the Gwaith Myrdain, the armour-piercing variant, you know, against the Dwarves. That would be very, very useful. We'll see. It's possible that he does have the Myrdain hidden away somewhere. He's got some Heruquinger, obviously Eldorenway archers, very good at range, very accurate, very deadly, and of course pretty decent in melee when all is said and done, which may well prove to be the saving grace from Ladris here. They are outnumbered and they did have less in terms of money, substantially less actually, but with a very defensive position and the fact that their archers are good in melee once they've expended all their ammo, that might be the thing which pulls them through in this battle. And he does have the Mirror Dane, which is good to see. Obviously multiple HP, previously called the Smiths of Aragian. Very, very powerful in melee. That armor piercing serves them really well against heavily armored factions like the Dwarves, of Erebor in this case. Got some Noritano warriors as well. They're actually pretty good in melee as well, although all things considered, not as impressive as some of the more expensive Eldorenway, Imladris options. But the thing that the Noritano warriors do have over the Eldarquingr is the fact that they are noticeably stronger in melee, so that might be what spurred Sareg to bring them in this case, considering he has less funds and will have to have his archers going to melee at some point. Another unit of Noritano warriors over here, and then we can see the High Elven firing squad also further along this path, which it looks as though the dwarves are going to be quite eager to take. And he does have a couple of units of Eldarquingr actually. Sans the armour upgrade, but even so, lower tier Elven archers are still going to be quite powerful. Fortunately for us, the Dwarven army is all pretty tightly compacted together. So obviously he's got some Ironfoot crossbowmen here on the front. Looks as though he's got 3 units, or is that 4? That's actually 4 units of Ironfoot crossbows, which is an interesting choice. Now, potentially a pretty good one, because they can absorb a fair amount of archer fire, although it is worth saying that, you know, they will be outranged and will take damage. But if they can get it set up onto one of the hills in particular and start raining down some bolts onto the High Elven defences, things could work out pretty well here for Indigo something, who's playing as Erebor. He's got some Ironfoot pikes as well. Now the Ironfoot pike's obviously going to be acting as the anchor for the Dwarven assault. We'll see if they can get into position though, because obviously a big part of the Imladris defence here is going to be their ranged pressure. They don't have too much infantry to deal with this Dwarven push. And then there's several units of Ironfoot warriors, obviously the bread and butter. They do have the armour upgrade, which should help them a little bit against that Imladris archer fire. But even so, they are going to be outclassed 1-to-1 in melee. Their numbers are going to be the key here. Good to see the Axe Guard of Erebor back here as well, because obviously Imladris, they do have some nice armor values on their units, so the AP from these two-handed axes gonna come in pretty handy. So he's got a couple of units of them, 3 units of them in fact. And then back here, now this seems to be where most of his money has gone actually, because he's got several units of Dragon Slayers, 3 units of Dragon Slayers of Arid Mithrin actually, which is an interesting choice. I mean, I suppose that it's possible the players agreed to these army compositions beforehand. But if not, if there was a free choice, I certainly would have recommended only having 1 Dragon Slayer and then maybe offsetting that with some Highborns of Erebor and some Obsidian Guard, purely because that would have given you much more money to spend elsewhere. But even so, there's no doubt the Dragon Slayers are going to be the cornerstone to the Dwarven offense here. If they perform well, the Dwarves have got every chance to win. If they don't, however, then they will probably lose. They're probably going to live and die based on this decision that Indigo has made here. And the Catapult, Dwarven Catapult, good for smoking out enemies from certain positions, preventing blobs from forming up. But if they do go along this narrow mountain path, there's every chance that they'll be sniped out quickly by the High Elven Ballista, so they do need to be careful. Obviously I will make a little cut here because it's going to take the Dwarves quite some time to march down this narrow path, but when we rejoin, I assume the Elves will have the first say in this fight with their archers in the superior position that they are in. So, as you can see, the Dwarven player thankfully is not going to be committing all of his resources down that one mountain path. He is splitting up, trying to stretch the Elves as much as he can, which if he executes it correctly is exactly what he needs to do, to be fair. These 2 Noritano warriors have taken up position to start pinning the Dwarves from a distance, which obviously Erebor, just in general, have got this weakness to them, the fact that they don't really have any long-range composite bowmen. They're they are entirely reliant on artillery for their really long-range skirmish. But they do have their Ironfoot crossbowmen moving up, which if they get into position, the Noritano warriors will be forced to shuffle back a little bit, because they really don't want to be getting into a skirmish fight while allowing the Ironfoot crossbowmen to get their volleys off, because the stopping power of crossbows is really going to be a problem for the High Elves as they retreat. But obviously timing is going to be critical here. If they don't time the assaults to be at exactly the same time, the Dwarves, or well, if the one player actually, if Indigo doesn't time the assaults to be at exactly the same time, the Elves will still be able to a point focus down one of the 2 sort of sub-armies here. But he is trying to do the right thing, at least trying to pull the Elven player around a little bit, trying to corner his defences, although this is a little bit of a misplay here. He doesn't have any of his anti-cavalry units close by. The pikes are trying to shuffle up as quickly as they can, but as I'm sure you noticed, the Gwathi Rockdor are on the way. Now this is slightly risky. with the Ironfoot there are 2 units of Ironfoot crossbows over here, of course, so, you know, and again, this is maybe a little bit of a misplay here. Indigo clearly not seeing the Knights coming, and that's going to be a nasty charge. Knights in general have got such a devastating charge, and he's still just pushing on a little bit. And again, he's trying to get now, but he really should have seen that coming. I mean, that's exactly the sort of thing that you just cannot miss. And the cavalry here is going to be able to cycle charge, and again, this does speak to maybe a little bit of an experience. Pushing up your skirmishers so far ahead of your anti-cavalry units, especially when you've got a unit as devastating as the Gwaithly Rock Door just hanging around. And unfortunately that volley as well didn't really connect. The cavalry was able to interrupt it just in time. There are a lot of nice units over here, but again, the pike's just lagging too far behind, so Indigo needs to be more careful on that if he's to win. He cannot afford to lose his crossbows. The crossbows and the Dragon Slayers are the 2 cornerstones of his attack here. If he loses them, I can't see him winning. The Ironfoot units in general just not going to be able to hold too much of a candle to the elite Imladris forces. And this is a somewhat unique situation. One of the things that a 1v1 siege on a more open map like this does have is a lot more room to manoeuvre around in. Oftentimes, larger maps like this tend to devolve into individual block fights, which obviously my computer never fails to cry at the sight of. But this time, there's going to be a lot more space to work with, and in particular that will probably suit the elves a little bit more, although eventually they are going to be forced into a mass engagement with the dwarves. The dwarves just need to be a little bit careful here though. That was a poor start from them, and I can't really see what Indigo's attention would have been focused on other than that, because there's nothing going on over here that he would have had to focus his attention on. His troops just slowly but surely marching down. Obviously this is where the classic map started, up here with the bridge, and you would then just march down. It was really nothing but this sort of L shape here in the corner. WK added a huge amount to this map, and the long range of Imladris here being used to their advantage, although the Ironfoot crossbows are actually in range. They do need to reload quickly, however, and get a volley off, but again, the Noritino warriors engaging a hit and run. The slow reloading of the crossbows proving to be their Achilles heel here, and the dwarves cannot afford to be suckered into the High Elves game here. To an extent, they're going to have to take a lot of damage on the chin. Erebor in general, of course, can't really afford to get mixed up for too long in these skirmish fights, so I'm actually very surprised that he's pushing up his crossbows first. The Ironfoot warriors with their armour upgrades are pretty much ideally situated to be the first ones in. He also needs to move his pikes up to support to make sure the Gwaithly Rockdoor cannot just charge as they will. Yeah, but this is still a bit of a dicey situation for Indigo. He needs to be careful. If he can bottle the High Elves up, however, I keep calling them the High Elves out of habit, I suppose. If he can bottle Imladris up and use his superior numbers, that's going to be his key to victory, because Imladris, as we said, haven't brought a huge amount of infantry. As you can see, the dwarves slowly but surely making progress on this side as well. Up here, the Eldar Quinga are now reloaded, here at the ideal time. And again, the Ironfoot crossbows are out in front, which is a mistake. In my opinion, crossbowmen in a siege like this are much, much better placed, being saved to the end, when the enemy have expended their ammunition supply, or at least most of their ammunition supply. You don't want to be losing your crossbows this early. Meanwhile, we have once again the Gwaithly Rockdoor doing some nice damage to the Dragon Slayers this time. Ooh. Now the Dragon Slayers, to be fair, did actually cause the Gwaithly Rockdoor to become shaken, and again Indigo's reactions just not up to snuff. Although to be fair, a bit of a mistake there from Sareg as well. He retreated his cavalry, but not far enough out of range of the crossbows, and they do take a few more losses from another volley. I'm not sure if that was a good trade or not for the High Elves. At this point, their cavalry pressure is proving to be a really useful tool. But cutting down on some of those Dragon Slayers would have been very, very nice indeed, especially seeing as over here it's the only unit of Dragon Slayers they have available. Again, not ideal manoeuvring from Indigo, but at least he was able to make the High Elven cavalry pay for that charge. Previously, of course, they were able to get away with it scot-free. Let's go and see what's happening over here as the dwarves move forward. Now this, of course, is the advantage that Rivendell gives you. These very nice firing positions, although to be fair, a lot of these Eldar Quinga are just burying their arrows into the hillside, which is a bit of a reprieve for the dwarves. but by the same token they are essentially being forced to take casualties on the advance. Of course, as far as factions that can sort of survive an arrow storm with less casualties go, the Dwarves of Erebor are right up there. But this is Elven skirmishes we are talking about, so more of these arrows will hit. So again, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And I think they're going for the Axe Guard of Erebor, which is a very nice choice. They do not have the shields, and they are going to be a substantially bigger threat in melee than the Ironfoot Warriors. And again, this does speak, I think, to a little bit of inexperience from Indigo. I don't know if he is a player that is playing or not, that has played before or not, because people can change their names on Steam, of course, which makes my job a little bit more tricky than it needs to be. So it could be someone who I've seen play plenty of times before, or it could be a completely new player. But regardless of this, moving up these units into range of the archers so carelessly does speak to a little bit of inexperience. Now, of course, the elves are going to have to shuffle back. We can see the kiting is in full effect here, which in this sort of situation I'm fine with, just because it is a 1v1 siege and it is an advantage that the elves can press. On a field battle it can be somewhat more frustrating. The Noratuno Warriors once again moving out, and again I think at this point the Dwarven player is maybe a little bit flustered because he doesn't really know what to do, and he is allowing Sareg to continue with the tactics that he's used thus far. Noratuno Warriors coming out on either side again, just popping in and out, essentially employing hit and run tactics. And again, Indigo hasn't learnt his lesson, because once again he's shuffling out with his crossbows first, and the crossbows are going to take an age to reload. Even though the Noratuno Warriors were not able to get any volleys off there, neither are they going to take any casualties for moving forward in such an aggressive fashion. And this Dwarven army, I think, is just waiting for the others to catch up, which again does speak for the fact that the Dwarven player did not move his armies in tandem to the extent that it was needed. Admittedly, the onus is on the Dwarven player here to move both of his sub-armies together in the fashion that's required, whereas Imladris don't really have to do anything in that regard. They can just sort of sit and wait. So it is more difficult for Indigo to move his army in that respect. But by the same token, I mean, you do expect maybe a little bit more of a unified front. The Ironfoot crossbows getting in position, they will be able to get a volley off, but again, is it really worth using your crossbows on a unit of Eldar Quinga? Again, the hit and run tactics being employed, the crossbows just too slow really. They are going to get a volley off, but again, not really grievous wounds being dealt to the elves here, and they have several units of these archers getting ready. And the Dwarven player needs to stop trying to make this a skirmish fight. This is not Erebor's strength at all. He needs to, once again we see over here another poor play. The Ironfoot crossbows just being charged by the Gwathi Rockdoor again, because they were sent out without support again. And again, maybe this is going to be a similar fight to what was before on Imladris. Maybe it is going to be a case of a more experienced player just beating up on a newer player, which is likely to get me a bit of flack in the comments. But I guess it does twin quite well with the other Rivendell fight we saw, if that's the way it is. See what's happening over here. The Heru Quinga now getting into position. Well, the Heru Quinga, to be fair, would be a more worthwhile target for the Ironfoot crossbows to go after, but by the same token, the Heru Quinga have got higher missile damage, so this is going to be a little bit more brutal for the Ironfoot crossbows to try and deal with. They're already winded, and again, the Dwarven infantry is dragging its heels behind the crossbows. Eventually, however, this is going to turn into an infantry fight with all those Dragon Slayers, all that Dwarven infantry. We'll see. Especially with the elves essentially surrendering the higher ground, which is going to give the crossbows the range they need to actually engage in skirmish fights with the Elven archers. It'll be interesting to see how that works out. Definitely a very elite-focused infantry corps to the elves. We'll see if they rue not bringing some of their more numerous bread and butter infantry units. Noratuno Warriors coming into position over here, and again, I mean, if they're able to get volleys off from this close, then Indigo really has no one to blame but himself for not noticing that. And they are. And it might be into the pikes, and indeed it is into the pikes. hitting the Dragon Slayers as well. I'm extremely surprised, honestly, that the Elven player is being allowed to get away with all of this. Still not been noticed. That's almost criminal. This is going to be a third volley they're going to be able to get off. The Dragon Slayer is now finally moving. And that should be sufficient to chase the Noratuno warriors off. Or are they going to get greedy and go for another volley? They are. This might get them killed though. So this might be a pretty substantial misplay from Sarek. They are going to get caught, yeah, they're going to try and wriggle away. But they are going to take some fairly significant losses from these two Dwarven infantry units. They are going to run. They might break, but even so, even if they do, they'll just go back to the town centre. A fair few Noratuno there, taking a fairly hefty chunk of damage. Ooh. Overshot that wildly. And I believe that is going to be the High Elven Ballista taking pot shots at the Dwarven units across the way and getting some hits. And again, I feel like aggression was going to be the Dwarves' best friend here. They just needed to, as long as they kept their armies moving in a reasonably uniform fashion on both sides of the river, they should have just pushed and been aggressive, trying to force a mass infantry engagement as quickly as they possibly could. As it is, Indigo's been far, far too eager to make this a grindier skirmish affair, which, when you're Erebor playing against one of the Elven factions in particular, that is a big no-no. Here goes the Dwarven Catapult. A big spread of projectiles there. None of them really hitting their mark though. That is the issue with the Dwarven Catapult. When things are as spread out as this, very rarely are they going to find their mark. And I think, well I hope actually, that Sareg is going to destroy this Dwarven Catapult, which will hopefully force the Dwarven player into being a little bit more aggressive, because if he continues like this, he's doomed. And hopefully the loss of most of his long-range options will force him to be a bit more aggressive. They've got over here continuing pressure from the Dwarven infantry as the Noratuno warriors continue to kite. Once again, the Ironfoot warriors are out in front, taking the charge from the Gwathi Rockdoor, who've been able to get so many free kills. And again, the Ironfoot pikes just chilling back there. A volley of crossbow bolts come in once again, not enough to kill any Gwathi Rockdoor this time though. See, the Eldar Quinga are down here now, as the elves just content to kite, and that's kind of what they have to do with their more limited infantry presence, but the Dwarven player is allowing them to do this in a big way. Again, I feel as though when you have a lot of people are very eager to, they have a plan at the start of the game and they want to stick to that plan. They're very, very reluctant to deviate from it, and not being flexible in that way can often lose you the game, and I feel as though that is what slowly but surely is happening here. I think the Dwarven player wanted to situate his skirmish line up in a nice position, get his crossbow bolts firing, soften the elves up, and then when they were good and weak, bring the hammer down with the infantry, but that has not materialised at all. He has not been able to utilise his skirmishes really in any way, shape or form, effectively anyway. His crossbows have been bullied by the Elven archers and the cavalry, and he hasn't really been able to come up with an effective plan B yet. He does have the significant funds advantage going into this fight, so we'll see if that is ultimately enough to see him through, but I have my doubts at this point in time. The Ironfoot crossbows are shuffling forwards. Again, the fact that the Axe Guard are in front of the Ironfoot warriors when there are so many archers around is again something which maybe points me in the direction that this player is a newer player. The Eldar Quinga getting into position. Again, it could turn into a skirmish fight. Still those ballista. And I couldn't help but notice as well that the dwarves were actually shuffling backwards over here. And still all of this infantry just sort of hanging out here and waiting. We are getting towards the final 10,000 frames though. Not an awful lot has actually happened as of yet, but all of it has been relevant. All of this kiting, all of this poking and prodding at the Dwarven infantry has been a part of the battle which needs to be shown to give some context. As as the catapult gets ready to presumably try and resume its bombardment with the slight cover of these banks. The High Elven Ballista, however, is trying to poke and prod at the Dragon Slayers, and as I've said, the Dragon Slayer is really the centrepiece to this Dwarven army. They've already taken a lot of losses before a melee fight has ever looked like getting underway. You can see here the tight formation of the Dwarves working against them as the loose formation of the Elves, seeing them through. Although they are taking a lot of losses, to be fair, from the crossbows. You'd expect actually the crossbows to win this skirmish fight quite handily. But even so, the Elves are more content to try and rob the Dwarves of their melee prowess. And again, the crossbows not targeting the Knights. The Axe Guard are coming in here. More Elven arrows coming in. They can scarcely miss the Dwarves at this point in time. As we have a look, you can see, obviously, the Elves almost doubling the total of the Dwarven casualties that they've managed to inflict. What have we got going on over here? Again, the Ironfoot crossbows trying to set up a nice skirmish line, which, as they sort of squeeze the Elves in a bit, will become more of a likelihood. But if the Dwarves are not committing all of their infantry to tie up all of this Imladris infantry, then this sort of piecemeal engagement on either side, with all of those infantry units just stood around idling, is ultimately going to bite them. Because these Ironfoot warriors are going to get absolutely crushed by Gwaith and Myrdain. This is not going to be pretty. Actually see some Elven archers trying to soften up the Dwarven shield wall, but yeah, this is a fight which is only going to go in one direction, unfortunately, for the Dwarves. And the crossbows still taking a bit of a beating in the skirmish fight. They've already taken losses, of course, from the cavalry previously, and from hit-and-run skirmishes, which have happened up till now. It looks as though actually that the High Elven cavalry has been completely destroyed at this point. The Dwarven crossbows trying to soften up the Elven skirmish line just that little bit more. But the Elves will accept this. The more damage they can do to this Dwarven infantry, the damage-dealing Dwarven infantry in particular, the happier they will be. And again, more and more of the Dwarven reserves over here just taking more casualties from the High Elven Ballista. Dwarven catapult just waiting, and at this point the Dwarves, I think they need to commit at this point. I think they do. Oh no, there is still some High Elven cavalry, not much of it though. And obviously defeat is almost a certainty for these Ironfoot warriors. The Gwaith and Myrdain, a much, much superior infantry unit to the Ironfoot warriors. Still there's Ironfoot crossbows back here, and at this point the cavalry is really just being used as tools to stop the crossbows from firing, which, when there's only 3 men in the unit, certainly understandable. They might even cause these Ironfoot crossbows to break, actually. These High Elven Knights are fearsome sight on the battlefield, and again the crossbows are being left without support. And again, the Ironfoot pikes lagging so far behind. It's the Gwaith and Myrdain. They have actually taken a couple of losses to the Ironfoot warriors, which is impressive, although that might be to the crossbows as well. It's been hard to tell. But the Ironfoot warriors still will lose that fight pretty substantially. There's some Axe Guard coming in to try and support against the Gwaith and Myrdain. Whether or not the Ironfoot will actually be here when they arrive is another matter. Again, at this point, the Elves, there are a few cracks in their defences, but the Dwarven infantry is so far away that they can't take advantage of it, which is such a shame. The High Elven archers just sort of waiting. Some of them are out of ammunition, actually. But this is where the action is at the moment. Not in the gully, but in here. Ironfoot warriors actually not going to break, so the Gwaith and Myrdain actually could break themselves here, lingering in melee perhaps a little bit too long. Takes quite a lot to cause one of the Elven Uber tiers to become wavering or shaken. That is what is happening as it stands, and the Elves starting to feel the pressure a little bit. Here's the Heru Masil and some Heru Quinga, some Norituno warriors also heading over here. As the Myrdain does live to fight another day. More arrow fire being poured into the Dwarven infantry. A few more Axe Guard falling by the wayside. And again, the Dwarves do still stand a very good chance in this fight, purely because they have a lot more funds available to them than Sareg. who he did send me the funds actually, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. It might have been 12k to 20k, I'm tempted to say, although I might be remembering that wrong. I'm sure that he'll comment anyway to make up for my ignorance. But even so, we shall see how this unfolds. I mean, these Eldarquingr, I think, are just trying to absorb the crossbow fire, make sure the dwarves don't have any bolts left to them as the fight goes along. Still those elven pikes as well. What have we over here? Some Noritino warriors shooting at point blank into the dragon slayers. Meanwhile, over here, once again, the elves are engaging in melee. They're engaging the axe guard. Now, in this fight, I would certainly back the Heru Masil, although with the support of those bolts, maybe not. I'm actually real surprised that the Ironfoot pikes are not moving up to support, especially seeing as they will certainly make a good target for the elven archers. Make sure that the high elven pikes are left unopposed into the late game. Yeah, the Heru Masil. Their armor values will actually be taken advantage of by the axe guard, but they also have the skill, very high attack values as well, to the point you would certainly expect the Elder Enway to win this, and indeed they are slowly but surely slicing their way through. They've actually got some Ironfoot warriors in support as well, so it was a 2v1 and the elves still fairly comfortably winning it. And actually, with the lack of movement from the Dwarven infantry elsewhere, they are going to be able to focus down this sub-army over here a little bit more, and the Gwathi Arthand are moving forward to that end. It's going to be very difficult for the dwarves to get rid of outside of their crossbows. The crossbows at this point have taken some fairly hefty losses themselves. Hello. Those dragon slayers still very much alive, 11 of them left, but they are going to have to head through the withering arrow storm that the elves are going to be laying on for them. Here comes some Dwarven infantry now, trying to take advantage of maybe the fact that the elves are having to engage elsewhere. You can also see actually as well that there is going to be some movement over on this side of the lake, or river. I'm not entirely sure what he's doing here. I mean, to be fair, getting across bridges can be a real pain. You need to sort of force path your way across. But even so, I think, you know, that issue is actually going to cost the dwarves pretty dearly here, because these men over here are just sort of marooned. Here we can see the Dragon Slayers, Eldarquingr pushing past, and actually you can see now that Imladris, seeing the floundering of the Dwarven lines across the river, they are going to focus down this sub-army first, which is exactly the right thing to do. Imladris sentries on the way forward. The Gwathi Myrdain going to try and tidy up the Dragon Slayers, who penetrated quite far into Rivendell actually. But you would imagine this is probably going to be the end. Even if they do manage to pull out the victory against the Gwathi Myrdain here, there will not be enough left of them to make a real challenge of a fight elsewhere. Heru Masil still fighting hard, although they have paid for it pretty dearly. Here come the Imladris sentries moving forward, getting into their formation, getting into their phalanx. The Ironfoot pikes here with the Ironfoot warriors. But they are going up against a superior unit here in the Gwathi Arthand. They do outnumber them, but you would still imagine that the Imladris units here would slowly but surely pull some kind of victory out, especially when there are so many reinforcements on the way, these Ironfoot pikes. Imladris sentries here, certainly going to be a real problem, although those crossbows could do some pretty decent damage of their own. Meanwhile, you can see actually that the Gwathi Myrdain and the Dragon Slayers have actually brought the numbers back into a fair amount of equilibrium, but it's still going to be a case of both of these units are going to tear so many chunks out of each other that it's going to be a Pyrrhic victory for whoever manages to win that. Meanwhile, the dwarves are now starting to push into the settlement. What's going on over here? The High Elven Ballistas still have ammunition? Hard to say. The God Helym trying to do as much range damage as they possibly can. The Axe Guard would be a pretty good target for that. Although they certainly want to stay out of range of those crossbows, which they are not doing a good job of now. And suddenly, the strength of the crossbows becomes a little bit more apparent. So a bit of a misplay there from Sareg, actually, leaving one of his elite units in full view of a Dwarven firing squad. And the Gwathi Myrdain are going to be able to win against the Dragon Slayers, just. Elder Enway Heru Quingr over here, and this is going to be the end of this Dwarven sub-army over here. Those units are going to rout off. They might come back. Well, probably not actually. The Imladris forces are chasing them down. So that's a good break for the elves, because now they're going to need to form up and get ready to face the dwarves as they approach. And actually the dwarven player gave up on trying to force Wrath across the bridges and is going to take the long way around, which actually could work in the elves' favour. Well, actually the dwarves have already moved into the settlement enough that it doesn't really matter. The elves are going to have to try and reform. They do need to be a little bit careful because obviously the town centre is the key here. The dwarves could just make a play right for that. So the elves are going to need to get their resources back here. In particular, the pikemen are going to be really, really key in this fight. Wraith the Arthland is still alive as well. Nice hardy unit of spearmen there. The God Helene took a real savaging at the hands of those crossbows. And now forward come the dwarves. This is the business end of this fight at this point. Rapidly approach the end. And they're pretty spread thin here, the elves at this point, over near the town centre. The Ironfoot warriors here charging in, and they'll be able to beat a unit of battered Eldar Quinga without too many issues. Forward comes some Dwarven Axe Guard as well. Ironfoot crossbows trying to get into position. Come the Elder Renway Haru Quinga as well, not half bad in melee. They do have their swords out. Here comes some Noraturno warriors as well, not bad in melee either. The Elven Skirmishers really going to have to prove the fact that they're good in melee at this point, because I don't think Imladris can pull this victory out without the Haru Quinga doing some work in particular. They really need to beat back this first wave quickly, I feel. Some Gwathi Myrdain, only 8 of them left. The next wave is rapidly approaching. A lot of these Erebor units are tired at this point, however. We'll see if the damage caused to those Dragon Slayers by the Ballista will prove to be key or not. What have we got going on here? Gwathi Arthand. Whatever happened to the pikeman? Ah, here they are. With the High Elven Ballista crew as well. Every little helps in melee at this point. More men coming, although these are dwarves. Ironfoot crossbows out of ammunition at this point. That could be a pretty key factor as well. They make pretty decent makeshift infantry units, but up against Elven skirmishers in melee, Imladris is certainly going to be strong enough to take that one home. Here comes the next wave, however, and this is the one that includes the Dragon Slayers as well as more Axe Guard, more Ironfoot as well lagging behind. Although at this point the Dwarven units are starting to get very tired. Could be a pretty key factor. The God Helene should still have ammunition. As the elves continuing to fight. Without reinforcements, Imladris would win this fight over here, but there are going to be reinforcements, which is the main issue. And at this point, Erebor need to spread out. They need to go down this road over here, surround the elves, or at least try to. Spread their resources thin. And try and win that way, I think. And the Dragon Slayers, the strength of the Dragon Slayers you would imagine should be sufficient to win that. We shall see. Actually, one of the Dwarven units, it looks like, did come back from routing over here. Some Ironfoot crossbows, although they're fighting against the High Elven Ballista crew in melee, so wet noodle fight. What have we here? Pikes. Sareg needs to commit these pikes somewhere. He can't afford to dither too long. Otherwise the Dragon Slayers are going to come in like a wrecking ball. Defeat is a distinct possibility for the crossbowmen against the elite High Elven Spears. Who could have seen that coming? Here are the Dragon Slayers. They're going to be going right into the pikes. Now, the pikemen moving forwards into the charge, not a great idea. That's going to allow the Dragon Slayers to get a lot of charge damage off on the Imladris sentries. Their formation was knocked down. That's not great for Imladris. The percentage is getting much, much closer. The God Helene are trying to fire. I don't know, I mean, you know, the discrepancy in funds was significant, so perhaps the Dwarves will be able to win based just on that, even with the misplays. Dwarves now starting to squeeze in with the pikes. And it does go to show how important just having a lot of funds over your opponent can be. Because things are looking grim for Imladris at this point in time. And I maintain that the Dwarves have made numerous mistakes in this fight. They could have been winning to an even greater extent at this point. And I say winning, they're still technically behind. But you would imagine that's going to flip the other way pretty soon. The Dragon Slayer says defeat seems certain, which, you know, with this pike formation, you would imagine that the Dwarves, now the Dwarves are going to surround this area with the Axe Guard, which should make a significant difference. Buckle that pike formation a little bit more. The Gwaith the Arthand are strong, but again, they are not really focused around dealing damage, they're just focused around staying alive. What happened to the Ballista crew? Well, the Norotino warriors are going to pull this one out, although it looks as though the Ballista crew all perished in this fight over here. Defeat seems certain for the Axe Guard. The Norotino warriors surrounding the surround. And the Heru Quinga now. And actually, this bit of savvy play there from Sareg. He's managed to split the dwarves up, try and surround them. Utilise the Elven skill as much as possible. And here come the God Hellemen. They are no pushovers in melee either. It's going to take a substantial Dwarven unit to defeat them, the Dragon Slayers. But I think they still have ammunition at this point, and I think they're going to be shooting point blank into the back of this particular Dwarven blob over here, or this one. They can take their pick, really. Yep, they're going to be shooting point blank into the pikes, which might be enough to make them break off. We're right at the end at this point, so I imagine actually, with all of these Dwarven units being shaken, wavering all over the place, that might be how this fight ends, with only 500 frames to go. Erebor's morale just not managing to hold itself together. The Imladra sentries, despite initially a pretty dodgy engagement against the Dragon Slayers, they managed to stabilise their formation a little bit, and again, maybe a little bit of inexperience committing your strongest infantry into the front of pikemen, just because even if they would win eventually, the pikes are still going to bog them down for so long. Now the God Heli might charge into melee, and that's going to be enough to rout this Erebor force over here. There's a lot of breaking going on, and I think there's going to be a defeat coming here, because the catapult is never going to make it down here in time. Indeed. Yeah, morale. Again, I feel as though this was a case of an experienced player really utilising the experience against a player which is not so experienced. A newer player in particular, certainly I think Indigo was, based on some of the moves playing. And I may have sounded a little bit critical of his plays, but again, he's a newer player, so you can't really hold it too much against him. At least that would be my assumption. It might turn out that he's actually a really experienced player who's just changed his name, but we'll see. Gwathi Rockdor getting a lot of kills, obviously. Those knights doing their job. What did the Mirrodane do? Not so great, actually. They had a bit of a tough time of it, I think mainly because they were outnumbered in every fight they were in, basically, early on. Heru Quinga getting a lot of kills as well, but mainly it was obviously the higher tier units. A small High Elven army, which managed to see off the Dwarves. So the opposite situation here. When an experienced player is on the defence against a not so experienced attacker, this can often be the result. Even with a big funds discrepancy in the end, Imladris for the most part were fairly comfortable. There was some blemishes towards the end there where you thought maybe the Dwarves could pull this out, but ultimately the damage had been done earlier on in the fight where the two sub-armies didn't move in tandem to the extent they needed to put the maximum pressure on Imladris. But even so, again, this wasn't the closest fight, but it is still a good piece of educational material, particularly for newer players who are trying to get into the game. Just an example of what not to do if you're attacking in a situation like this. Although this is a rarer situation, I feel like a settlement as big as this in a 1v1 is not often seen. So the kiting that Imladris indulged in here probably won't be a thing you see too often, but even so, kiting in general is still something you have to be careful of, especially when you don't have many ranged options like Erebor. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this for what it was. Coming up next, I've got a few things on the backlog. We'll see. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.